I did a lot of work in my last job with SMMT, so thanks to Mike and team for having me. I've been in trouble with the automotive sector in both my roles, actually, because I was previously the chief executive of the energy trade body, so on the hook for the energy prices you're facing in manufacturing. Now I'm on the hook for telling you how we're going to decarbonise the economy, and as you'll see, surface transport has a huge role to play in the future of decarbonisation, and specifically in the 7th carbon budget, which was the advice we just launched to government. This is hot off the press analysis, although I think for the SMMT staff, I'm sorry, this is probably the 3rd or 4th time you're seeing it, but it never hurts to repeat a message. And I'm going to take you through what we've just said to the UK government and what it means for the industry. So this is the new recommended carbon budget. And if you're not familiar with carbon budgets, as someone that's worked for 16 years in the private sector, what makes them great is they are unlike the climate governance in most other countries. We neither put caps on particular technologies, nor do we really have decadal targets. What we have are these envelopes of emissions reduction across 5-year periods in the economy, and we set them about 13 years out. And the intention in that is to allow for innovation to come through the market. We don't prescribe which technologies do the delivery, but also to give industries, particularly those of you that have to rework factories and OEM, but also in the sector I was in, build large infrastructure, talk to pension funds. It gives you at least a decade's horizon away from the short-term thinking in politics to see where your industry might have to go. And so there are, I think, a helpful pro-market tool for those of you thinking about what the future might look like with a medium long-term people. And what this chart shows you is the previous carbon budgets and the new one. So the ones that you can see on the left, the orange bars are the carbon budgets that we've already delivered from the 2008 Climate Change Act out to 2023. The pinkish ones, I've been told this colour is pinkish, so that's how I will continue to describe it. The pinkish ones are the carbon budgets that have been set and are still being delivered, so they're the work programme for government today. And the reason that the one labelled CB6, Carbon Budget 6, looks steeper is that was the first carbon budget set in line with the government's new net zero target. All the carbon budgets before that were set with the original target in the 2008 Climate Change Act of reducing our emissions by 80% against 1990 levels. Now it's a net zero target. And the bright purple one, which is the exciting one, is the new carbon budget. And we're recommending an 87% cut in emissions across the UK economy for the years 2038 to 2042. And that's what the block is. The purple line is what we have to do in order to give our advice to government. So alongside that number for government, that percentage reduction, we also have to say it's feasible and demonstrate that it's feasible. And so along with that number, we publish this time 400 pages of analysis and economic thinking, work with stakeholders like SMMT and other sectors of the economy, and we put together a plausible pathway to deliver the number. Now, critically, it's not mandatory, it's advisory, and what happens after this is the government accepts the number and legislates it, but then produces their own delivery plan, which may or may not look exactly the same as the numbers I'm going to show you today. But the purple line is the new pathway. And every time we do a carbon budget, we update the pathway because all of you innovate, technologies move on, the economy moves on, human behaviour changes. And so anything we have said previously about what the economy might do is now trumped, slightly pun intended, by the purple line that you see there. The grey line at the top shows you actual emissions. And as a last-minute punt for the carbon budgets, they've delivered. And so the UK was the first G7 economy to demonstrate that you could have economic growth alongside decarbonisation. We've genuinely halved our emissions against 1990 levels by almost half, and we've done that largely with technology replacement, specifically moving from coal to renewables in the energy mix. And importantly, we did it with a whole range of technologies that we didn't know existed back in 2008. So they've been a remarkable mechanism. Now, if you look forward, this is where emissions in the economy come from. I'm going to show you two bars that are important. On that very far left-hand chart is the first 3 carbon budgets and what emissions look like. And the colour to pay attention to in that bar is the bright yellow. I think bright yellow, it might look like a bit like a green for you. It's bright yellow. That bar is the power sector, and you can see that's where a lot of emissions were coming from in the economy back in 2008. That was because we were burning a lot of coal and gas in our power plant. If you look forward across the next 3 carbon budgets, which are the ones that we're in now, you can see emissions in that sector have really come down. So the yellow bar just kind of disappears through the next decade. what that means for you guys is surface transport, which is the bright purple block that you can see up there, is now the largest emitting sector in the economy proportionally, alongside emissions from buildings. And so if you're a policymaker right now, or you're worried about how the UK decarbonises, the responsibility for reducing emissions now sits very squarely with this industry, with the way that we heat our homes. And that is where I expect to see a lot of government policy attention. We also still need to build lots of clean and cheap electricity, and I'll get onto that. But it's the bright purple block that remains significant for now and is really significant in this seventh carbon budget. The good news is, after 2040, it becomes much more about agriculture and aviation. So what I'm telling you is there is a decade ahead of real change for these sectors of the economy, and then a success story. And thereafter, we get into trickier areas of the economy, including agriculture, aviation, and removals technologies coming in for where we can't remove any remaining emissions. And this sort of shows you the trajectory for change. So every line on here is a sector of the economy. Underneath that bright purple line on the first chart, what our analysts do is go sector by sector through the economy and work out a plausible pathway for each one. And again, the most interesting line for you guys is bright purple. At least we're consistent on colours. And it starts there, that's the surface transport share, and you can see it dropping through the 2030s into the 2040s. And emissions reductions from surface transport, we're expecting to drop around 86% between today and the 2040s, which is an astonishing rate of reduction, but underpinned with some analysis that I'll show you next. And this is another way of looking at the problem. Now, I came over from the energy sector, and so the only thing I was allowed to do to the carbon budget is this chart. So it's my favourite chart in all 400 pages. And it's a way of thinking about the problem by solution this time, rather than the sector of the economy. So that grey line is emissions to date. The purple line is the balanced pathway, the moderate route to delivering the carbon budgets. And the dotted line there is what happens if we do nothing at all, and it goes up a bit because we're expecting the population to grow, essentially. And these are all the measures grouped together. So that first wedge there is demand. And in demand, we've got two things. We've got behaviour change, and there is a little bit in there which is relevant to this sector, in that we expect around a 7% thing called modal shift, which is economists speak for not driving and instead walking or taking public transport. That's smaller, I think, than in previous carbon budgets, but it's still a good chunk of the demand reduction there. It's also things like diet changes or changes in the way people might fly, but it's a relatively small chunk of the carbon budget. Gets a lot of press, though. The other bit in demand is actual demand reduction in the way that we all think about it in industry, which is more efficient uses of technologies and commodities. So the best example I always give to people is it's the insulation fabric in your loft. It's that kind of measure, and again, grouped across the economy. This is the fun wedge on the chart, and the really big story about this carbon budget, and what actually I confess I was surprised to see in the 2030s, which is that electricity is absolutely the heart of how we do carbon reduction over the next decade and beyond. This wedge here is everything electrical in the system going forward, and that includes more energy generation coming from clean electricity and a doubling in the size of the power sector, but also using electricity in the economy, and that means lots of electric vehicles, lots of electric vans, electrification of surface transport in general, further than we've said before. Electrification for heat, we've ruled out hydrogen for heat in this carbon budget, and even electrification for some industrial processes where before we couldn't see a technology coming forward. And that's because we're much more confident in things like batteries and the economics thereof, and you can see that coming into every area of the economy now. So we're backing the economics of electrification, and as the former chief exec of the energy trade body, I will tell you that is a very sensible thing to do. The other notable thing about this is that it saves us energy across the economy, and I'll come back to that and show you what it does for costs. But we halve energy losses across the whole energy system doing this. So weirdly, despite the fact we're growing the size of the electricity sector, we halve the amount of energy that we use in the economy, which means we reduce our dependence on imports, amongst other things. So it's important when you're thinking about electric vehicles, you know, for me, with my old hat on, that you're thinking about them as part of a wider energy system change. And that's part of the reason that we're confident about electrification on the demand side, is that we can see a big change coming with how we generate power on the other side. There are still roles for fuels in the carbon budget, and there are some areas of transport that we struggle to see decarbonising with electricity alone because of the size of batteries and things like that. And in these cases, we've modelled a mix of hydrogen, synthetic fuels, low carbon fuels. A lot of this is for aviation, where we're assuming synthetic aviation fuel comes through, but we've also got carbon capture and storage and other fuels in the economy, so don't panic. We do see a role for hydrogen. We're just being much more specific about where it goes. And then the last two chunks are considered together, and basically over the next decade and then out beyond, high-emitting areas of the economy, the agriculture and aviation, end up becoming the folks that also solve the problem in terms of providing removals so that they can keep emitting, because we cannot see technologies available yet to fully decarbonise those sectors. So for farmers and for land managers and for rural communities, we're expecting to see them do things like plant trees, and restore peatland, and that helps remove carbon and other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, which means that we can still have cows and sheep and livestock producing methane. And the purple block at the bottom is mechanical engineering, so things like direct air carbon capture and storage, and we're expecting the aviation sector to pay for it on the basis they will be one of the few industries with enough emissions to justify paying for it, and that underpins the model. Another really nice way of thinking about this for all of you that are consumer-facing is this is the measures grouped by household choices. So people will quite often ask me, well, what does it mean for me? What should I do? And again, quite often the media narrative here defaults to things like flying or diet. The single biggest thing you can do as an individual human being, if you have the resources to do it, for decarbonisation in this country, when it comes to replace your vehicle and not before, buy an electric vehicle. When it comes to replacing your heating system and not before, get a heat pump rather than a gas boiler. We assume no scrappage in our modelling, so this just happens in the natural product replacement cycle. But it is an extraordinary contribution to your own household carbon footprint. And that purple block at the top is the electric vehicle, and the orange block is the heat pump. Everything else, putting in loft insulation, modal shifts, so more public transport, dietary changes, everything else, so those small chunks at the bottom. So again, you're really important to how people interact with a kind of feeling that they want to do something for climate change. This is just to bury a little bit into the detail on surface transport, and all I want to say here is it's a really steep reduction. Look, that spike there that you can see is real emissions, and that's what happened during COVID, and then we've had the rebound effect. This is what we're expecting the decarbonisation rate to look like for cars, vans, HGVs, rail, and other. You can see here again the purple chunk. Small vehicles, cars and vans decarbonise very quickly over the next decade, and it's largely because we can electrify them first and fastest. And again, this is another way of looking through the problem for surface transport, this time by measure. And the important message here is electricity is the winner in nearly every choice. So whatever part of the automotive sector you're from, we're saying if you can electrify it, you should probably electrify it. And thereafter, and only thereafter, will you be using fuels. So by 2040, we've got 3/4 of cars on the road in the UK as electric vehicles. And we've got 2/3 of vans-ish being electrified. Just in case you think that sounds unrealistic, and you know, Mike and I have had our chats over the years, when we model this, we model technology S-curves. So we model it as close to a real technology rollout as we can, and where possible, we base it on experience in other markets. So this shows you our balanced pathway in purple against the experience in places like Norway. It shows you the Bloomberg New Energy projections. It shows you SMMT's long-term outlook and our pathway somewhere in the middle. It's important to say that we don't have responsibility for things like industrial policy. We're not responsible for producing a cheap electric vehicle in the UK, or even just UK consumer behaviour on its own. We're looking across global markets. So one of the reasons we're very confident about this S-curve is we've seen it happen in other places. So if you get the incentives right in this country, it should be able to happen here too. And then the metric for driving that change is price parity, and we can argue about this, but we see price parity with an internal combustion engine vehicle for an electric vehicle in our modelling before 2030, and we're saying somewhere between around 2028 we think electric vehicles start to be cheaper than internal combustion engine vehicles, and that drives the progress that we're talking about. I'm conscious of time, so I might skip over this, but suffice to say, in the 400 pages online, we've also done the same S-curve modelling for percentage of electric vans in the fleet and also for HGVs, and that's what you can see here. And it's a similar story, a really rapid uptake over the next 10 years. Lastly, why do I think this will happen and it's a good thing? Net zero is often pitched as an economic cost, but the other thing that you are incredibly valuable for is saving the economy money. And that's because by electrifying the automotive sector, we save a huge amount in fuel, which is a key input into the economic model and saves the economy money. Also, because we think that electric vehicles have lower maintenance costs and some other lower operational costs attached to them, that's also an economic saving. And what that shows you here is those savings against costs for just the transport sector. And you can see there's a net benefit to the economy. That's why that line goes below zero. And the hashed lines are the savings, largely through fuel, but also through other operational efficiencies. And that purple bar is all electric vehicles. So again, getting people into EVs is really important. And you are behind what then that looks like for the whole of the economy in terms of savings. And really excitingly for me, this carbon budget is the first one where we start to save money for the economy for the upfront investment that we've made. So from 2040 onwards, through making these changes of the economy, the UK starts saving money and we start outpacing the money that we've put into upgrading our infrastructure, upgrading our charging network and getting people into these new technologies. And a lot of that saving, which is the bit below the line, comes from what we're going to do in surface transport. So many thanks for that on behalf of the economy. And lastly, this is what that looks like at household level, because I realised pitching to someone in a showroom that the economy might save money. Not ideal, but one of our primary recommendations to government is they need to make electricity cheap. And if they make electricity cheap, then by 2050, and or as soon as people get access to the technology, they start saving money on their bills. So what you can see here is the cost of a new heating system against the home energy bill. And for heat pumps, it's a slightly less good story than for electric vehicles, in that we've got to find a way to help people finance the heating system. But then they save about 700 quid on their bill relative to if they have a gas boiler. They're also 15 times less exposed to a future gas price if they have an electrified house, gas price spike, if they have an electrified house to one that's still dependent on fossil fuel technologies. For EVs, it's even better. We're expecting the EV to be cheaper than the internal combustion engine vehicle. And then once you have one, we're expecting you to save about 700 quid on your bill in terms of driving costs relative to keeping an internal combustion engine vehicle. That's a really powerful story, particularly at a time when people are struggling with the cost of living. I'll leave this slide up while I try and take as many questions as possible in the time I've got left. But these are the recommendations to government. You can't just, for electric vehicles, the story is so good that actually you guys, the market, we're confident are going to deliver a lot of this with the right sort of incentives from the government. However, there are some things that do really matter, the primary one of which is we have to make electricity cheap so that people feel the benefits of these technologies. And the others are around giving real certainty, so things like how the ZEV mandate works for all of you, things like having a certain charging network. We know that this will help people take the punt to move to a different form of transport. But ultimately, the fact that we think that this is going to be cheaper is a really good story. It's a good story for the consumer, regardless of what you think about net zero. But for me, in my job, it's an incredibly important story because we can't deliver UK decarbonisation or tackle climate change without you. So thank you very much for having me. I'm sure I'll be seeing you again.
Thank you so much. We've time for a couple of questions. I might take them together just for efficiency. So if anybody would like to pose anything to Emma, there's a hand right there at the back. Lovely. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, Emma Martin from Bosch. Thank you for the calculation. I really don't agree with it, not totally. I would like to understand how you did your calculation, because you did the calculation in isolation. You did only the EVs as such, but did you, for example, make the consideration of will-to-wheel or the whole life cycle, for example? Because then the calculation will totally change. And also, you know, the fuel, it's really subject matters, because electricity is sort of fuel. Yeah. So I think what I'm trying to say is not to undermine your calculation, but really, I think what we need to look into it is will-to-wheel, and really to look to the emissions more, not from the tailpipe, but more considerations from the whole cycle, because then you will have totally different aspects in the calculation of carbon, carbon budget, so, in my opinion.
Yeah.
We'll do more than one.
Is there another question from anybody? Yeah. Otherwise, we can concentrate. Okay, maybe this gentleman down at the front in the third row, and then let's see if you can combine that.
Yes.
My flashback to my economics degree question.
Hi, it's Chris from Shoesmiths. Just wondering if you've actually looked at the impact of vehicle to grid in some of these calculations and the benefits of flexibility for the system, because I think there must be an opportunity there as well.
Yeah.
Okay, Emma.
Okay, so life cycle emissions. So the accounting principles that the Climate Change Committee have to follow are the ones that are given for the IPCC, because we report up to the UN as part of the UK government's commitment. This is a long way of saying we model territorially, which means that anything that is an emission in the supply chain that's outside of the UK's borders, not modelled by us for complicated sovereignty reasons. However, we do life cycle modelling, so I am extremely confident, and so are the committee, that the emissions of an electric vehicle, including life cycle emissions, absolutely knock out of the park an internal combustion engine vehicle. So no, it wouldn't change our recommendation there in that wheel-to-wheel way. On what goes into thinking about cost, which I think was your question? Fuel. On fuel, yeah, it's a complex fuel model that sits underneath this, and we model it across the energy system. So I've got a beautiful Sankey, which I can show you, with the imports for things like oil, electricity and gas, and what this change in the economy means, and the prices thereof. We use the government's forward projections for energy prices, but also others, including from traders and people that we think might have the prices right. So again, confident on that. The important thing I didn't say when showing you those charts is that we're including the cost of driving. So the fuel cost is the biggest component of that. But on top of that, you do make savings at the moment on things like insurance, and I realise that all of you will yell at me and say the market might change. But I'm confident on the fuel pricing model, and yes, we do look across the whole economy. Do find the Sankeys. They're my second favourite chart in the document. They're beautiful, and that's why we make such significant savings for energy across the whole economy, actually. So we're knocking out a lot of oil, and we're using electricity across the economy. The question, I've forgotten it. That was good, isn't it? Vehicle to grid. We don't model vehicle to grid per se, I don't think, in the energy model. And I've had this argument with the energy team, especially coming over from working on retail solutions. And it's the same with things like flexibility for getting people to adopt heat pumps. We do, though, model a more flexible system, and we are ahead of, I think, where the government is on things like their Clean Power Plan, on the contribution we're expecting the demand side to make on flexibility. And it's that point that we look across the whole economy, so we're not just looking at electric vehicles or heat pumps in isolation. We're not just looking at a single tranche of the economy. We're looking at the energy system, and absolutely we can see the potential for that sort of offering. That means that those bills figures that I showed you, I think are conservative, that you could take more off that. Yeah.